The report of the Mother and Baby Home Commission described in Ireland where for large parts of the 20th century it was a very harsh place. It said that it was particularly harsh for women who became pregnant outside of marriage. The report chaired by Justice Murphy laid the blame for this primarily with the fathers of the children, the families of the women themselves, but also the structures of church and state. It said both church and state condoned this. This was a fact acknowledged by Primate of All Ireland, Archbishop Eamon Martin, when he spoke up at the shame he feels as a Catholic and the unreserved apology he issued on behalf of the church. Micheál Martin issued a similar apology on behalf of the state. I'm joined by David Quinn and Breda O'Brien, both columnists with the Irish Catholic, to look at some of the context in this. First, David, perhaps, where do we proportion blame for this? Church, state, society?
Well, I think the report actually got it right. It didn't point a finger at any one institution or organisation within society. I think it looked at the whole matter extremely realistically. It knew that the attitudes towards unmarried mothers and their children was the result of a confluence of forces. And obviously the Catholic Church was a big part of that because the Catholic Church was so big in Ireland and became, particularly big and influential after independence. But it doesn't go down the route of simply blaming it all on the church, which is what some politicians have done, because that would be unrealistic and not true to the history. But the church obviously must take blame where it must take blame, because it both reinforced and reflected too many of the harsh attitudes of the time, too much and too uncritically, and it didn't seem to really try to gain any proper critical Christian distance from them, and it didn't offer the kind of witness it ought to have offered. And when you think about what Pope Francis is trying to do nowadays, he's trying to rebalance and recalibrate the church. Not that it particularly needs to be done in this part of the world anymore, but probably in some other parts of the world, from too much of an emphasis on standards without mercy, and bring the kind of pendulum back more towards mercy, because for too long we overemphasize standards and we're very harsh towards those who manifestly and obviously fell outside those standards or fell below what we felt were those standards. And that was certainly the case for unmarried mothers, and their children, were obviously badly damaged by that whole thing as well.
And Breda, there's been a fair bit of pushback on the report from some quarters, people saying that, for example, that the Commission may have gone too soft on the church or gone too soft on the state. They reject the blaming of families. How do you view that? Are they correct?
Well, I think it's very interesting, the difference in the reception to the Murphy report, which of course also was chaired by Justice Yvonne Murphy. It's very interesting to see words like legalistic and whitewash and, even some people advocating completely rejecting it being used in this instance. I think that it's very difficult for us as a society to deal with the fact that I'm going to hesitate a little bit here. I was going to say we all let them down. We all let people down, but there were always exceptions, which I'd like to talk about later, people who didn't take, the consensus. But it's certainly, I think, to use the kind of language of today, I don't think people identified as, well, that's the church, that's the state, that's being Irish, that's being Catholic. And lots of people suffered from that, if you're looking at our, at ecumenism and so on as well. But there was a kind of an unhealthy kind of intermeshing, so that I think the report used the words that the church and state condoned and supported and added to what was actually going on. And definitely it was families, but it was also the neighbours. And right up to the 1980s, I was a student in the 1980s, I would have been afraid to go home pregnant to my parents because of feeling that the shame I would bring on them and the kind of, the attitudes of my neighbours and so on. So I think as a society, we had a very, very rigid viewpoint. Trying to, in a sense, preserve something that was good, the idea that marriage is a good place to bring up children, but doing it in a way that actually often lost all Christianity.
And one thing that struck me from the report, Breda, was the Commission said, first and foremost, that the girls should not have been in these places in the first place. Where did mother and baby homes come from?
what the point to be made about it was that it was set up as a mission to fallen women, and the question, of course, is where were the fallen men? It was designed to be an improvement on what was actually there beforehand, which was kind of the worst of the workhouses and so on. So it was actually seen as a step above. And they were to be found all over Europe, which is quite extraordinary, like in places that you wouldn't think at all. Now, I think that I think an analysis of it showed that at one stage that about 60% of them in Britain, for example, were run by Protestant. There was about 10 or 11% were Catholic, and then there were other local authorities the same way as we have here. And it's interesting as well, I think, how, in a sense, how lightly the local authorities have got off in this particular question, because they sometimes begged religious orders to come in and to run them, and then sometimes, particularly in the case of Tuam, underfunded them and so on. So that was the origins of them. They came to Ireland after an investigation into the poor law, I think, around the 1906 era, and again, it was decided to adopt the model that they would be run by religious organisations, and they, I think, presumed that, you know, they would be Protestant as well, and by local authorities, and that model then continued on for a long time. The one thing is that we held on to them longer than other places did, and we had far bigger numbers. They tended to be smaller in Britain, and we seem to have a talent for incarceration in Ireland. Like, we had extraordinarily high numbers in mental hospitals as well, and so there were probably more women actually went through them than they might have in other countries.
And David, Breda mentioned that these were not uniquely Irish or not uniquely Catholic. I think that'll come as a surprise to many people. What do we know about mother and baby homes in other countries?
Well, I mean, I suppose, like, it's a counterfactual, but if you removed the Catholic Church from Irish history, we'd say the British had succeeded in their aim of completely suppressing the Catholic Church, or people had been converted away from it. And we say that happened around 1800. Would we have had mother and baby homes in Ireland and the institutions in general? And the answer is an emphatic yes. They didn't originate in Catholic countries. They didn't originate in Ireland. We'd have had them here no matter what. And we'd have had the kind of social attitudes that led to them no matter what as well. In Britain, as Breda said, about 10% of the mother and baby homes there were run by the Catholic Church, which means 90% were not. There was a program on Channel 4 about 3 or 4 years ago about the mother and baby homes, and afterwards both the Catholic Church and the Church of England apologised for some of the attitudes that they helped to perpetuate that led to these places. And there were a very great many adoptions in Britain as well. I think the peak year was sometime around 1965 or thereabouts, when there was about 24,000 children adopted, mainly from the mother and baby homes. So that was a very widespread practice in Britain as well, but also elsewhere. And this is not in any way to kind of make excuses, but there is a narrative that these are a particularly Irish and Catholic invention, and it's simply not true. And we saw last week, by the way, of course, that there was a smaller mother and baby home report came out in Northern Ireland, and about half of the mother and baby homes examined were run, and there were some Magdalene homes as well examined, but about half of the mother and baby homes were run by the Catholic Church, and about half by one or another Protestant organisation, for example, the Salvation Army. And there were the same levels of stigma up there as well. The actual report down here into the mother and baby homes, which of course is about 2,800 pages, really throws the canvas very widely. It looks at places like Netherlands and Scotland, and in Scotland have found varied attitudes towards unmarried mothers, and have found a very close correlation between economic circumstances and the amount of stigma directed at unmarried mothers. And the poorer and more rural an area was, and the more economic welfare depended on one son inheriting the farm, the harsher attitudes became towards having a child outside marriage.
And Breda, I wanted to ask you about that. Actually, it brings me to my next question. How big a part did economic conditions play in the development of these institutions?
I think they played a very important role, really. I'm not someone who would see the world in terms of economics, but a book that had a huge impact on me was Dr. Finola Kennedy's From Cottage to Creche. And she brings out very powerfully, I think, that the mores of the Catholic Church fitted very well with a small agrarian, society without a great industrial base. And I remember reading something in one of Father Brendan Hoban's book, where he's quoting Professor Peter Connolly of Maynooth, who predicted in the 60s there would be a massive collapse in practice in Ireland, and his reasoning was that the Irish will be fond of something while it's useful, but they're not sentimental, and they'll dump it when it's not. So I think between those two people, there's a grain of truth in it. There definitely was an economic aspect to it, and this whole question of shame as well, of shaming people, that not only would the presence of an additional child be a difficulty, but it could also damage somebody's marriage prospects, particularly in a rural area. If you were the son who was going to inherit and your sister had a child or whatever. So there were all these complicated aspects to it. But it's interesting, I was reading a bit about the Legion of Mary, which we'll come to later on, I'm sure, but a very interesting thing where somebody who worked for the Legion quite early on said that the working classes usually found a way to either pass the child off as the last child of the mother or some way of wrangling it, but that it was the middle classes and the farmers who were out the door with you, daughter dear, so that's an interesting kind of first person account of what they perceived to be the truth. But it was still concealment. It still was a shame, and you're still trying to figure out a way to prevent the neighbours knowing about it.
And David, Breda mentioned there Frank Duff, the founder of the Legion of Mary, and we're celebrating the centenary of the foundation of the Legion of Mary this year. The report deals with one home run by the Legion of Mary in Dublin. What was the experience of that home?
Well, that was Regina Chaley, and it was founded in 1930, so quite early on in the history of the Legion. And the more time passes, the more of a hero Frank Duff emerges to be, because he was somebody who comes at various social problems with a completely Catholic lens, but comes up with a very different response to what was commonplace within the Catholic Church and within society as a whole at the time. So he says, I don't want to separate unmarried mothers from their children. I want the unmarried mothers to keep their children and to raise them. So the idea of Regina Chaley was to enable that to happen. And over the period of time that's examined, which is, I think Regina Chaley was doing this up until maybe the 1970s or the 1980s, about 5,000 women and about 5,000 children passed through its doors, which is a lot. The place was often very poor, starved of resources. It got no money from the public purse. The public purse had hardly any money at the time anyway. It relied almost entirely on private donations. The place was very run down. They had a high infant mortality rate, particularly in the 1940s, and all these institutions did. The 1940s was particularly bad because these were the years of World War II and privation. And infection mortality rates, or at least infant mortality rates rather, particularly in these congregated settings, went through the roof. But Frank Duff tried to do something very, very different. And it showed that the Catholic Church had stepped back a bit and said, what is really in keeping with Christian principles would have followed the Frank Duff approach.
Breda, I was struck earlier, you said that not everyone conformed to this harsh judgmentalism. What sort of examples do you have in mind?
Well, I think the huge exception from the point of view of public service are the female inspectors, particularly Miss Alice Litster, who was appointed, I think, in the early 20s and continued on almost until the 60s, and who was unsparing in her criticism and also very, very keen on fostering as opposed to these homes in the first place, and but also praised when there were good things. For example, even though she sometimes found Regina Chaley kind of irritating in the sense of that Frank Duff was quite determined to do things his way. she also said, as David pointed out, it was the only place in Éire, as she said at the time, that managed to keep mother and child together. So there was that terrific kind of public service aspect to things, where somebody was kind of ploughing a lone furrow. And some of her reports, there are notes on them, do not include this, including a very famous description of children in Bessborough as being emaciated and covered in rashes and so on. There were definitely people who could see outside the consensus, and then when change began to happen, it quite often happened from a kind of a confluence of two separate kind of strands that work together. For example, the setting up of Cherish, which was a kind of a one-parent organisation, which was set up by lone mothers themselves. That was really important. Advocacy by people like Mary Robinson and so on. But there also was another strand, which was kind of like people like Sister Stan and Bishop Birch of Ossory, who set up the first training for social care workers, which was a huge advance, because a lot of, there was, believe it or not, there was no professional training for people who are involved in social care. And of course, mother and baby homes come under that kind of category. And so there were people who saw, I believe in Bishop Birch's case, that there were a number of reasons why. One was that he had a brother with Down syndrome. And I think also as well, a kind of an innate compassion for people who were being pushed outside the mainstream at that time. So right down from the very beginning, there have been people who have stood outside the consensus and said, no, this isn't good. We shouldn't be doing this. We should be doing something different.
David, one of the things that made the most headlines about the report was the high infant mortality rates within the homes. How do you explain those infant mortality rates?
One is because, and the chief one, congregated settings. When an infection gets into a place where there's a lot of people, a lot of babies, a lot of small children, then it's going to spread rapidly from one to the other. Like we see that in the nursing homes today, what's happening in these congregated settings, and how easy it is to spread throughout these places. Very poorly resourced. The peak period for these deaths, as I said earlier, was the 1940s, the war years basically, and then it begins to decline very, very rapidly from the late 40s, early 50s. And why? Chief reason is good sanitation, because poor sanitation seems to be the biggest killer of all. So if you can get clean water, that immediately cuts the death rate. Second thing, of course, vaccinations begin to come online in a big way, and antibiotics. So when you've got good sanitation, antibiotics and vaccinations, all these things are going to cut the infant mortality rate, not just in the homes, but in society as a whole. But the report points out, and I think Breda said it as well, that unlike in Britain, our mother and baby homes were particularly big. And it could be 100 or 200 babies or small children in these places at the same time, whereas there might be only 20 in one of the British homes. So if something like measles or gastroenteritis gets into one of these places, well, then it has far more victims to claim. And so there were years, I think Bessborough, maybe 1943, when the infant mortality rate was an absolutely horrendous, nightmarish, I think 75%. So I think that's what was going on.
I think as well that there are all sorts of things that we know now about children and how to care for them, and particularly I think children of coming from difficult circumstances in the first place. For example, all sorts of things about attachment and bonding, and there was a kind of a and this wasn't just in mother and baby homes, this was across society. Whenever you had children taken out of their home situation, where there wasn't, I suppose, in a sense, enough understanding of the needs of little people to be with their mothers and to be nurtured by their mothers. And as David says, obviously disease would sweep through them, and one would hate to think, and I think sometimes we have to acknowledge that this was the case, that perhaps they were, there was under-resourcing, chronic under-resourcing of some of them. Some of them were no better than workhouses to start with, and there was a constant fight to try and get them upgraded, particularly those that were run by the local authority. And all of that is true, but there also might have been a thing of these children not being our children, you know, not being as well looked after in some instances because they weren't, you know, they weren't like other children. They had the stain of illegitimacy or whatever. I think there might have been an element of that as well, which I think is tragic.
Something, by the way, that's worth, I think, pondering is, so people might say, okay, so this is not specifically a Catholic thing, but maybe it's a Christian or religious thing, you know, that is the attitudes towards unmarried mothers and their children, and this, you know, creationist stigma. So the report, you know, I mentioned it looks at Scotland, but they could say, well, that was a religious society at the time. It looks at Netherlands, which of course became secular quicker than we did, but it also looks at what was happening a bit in countries like Sweden and Switzerland. Now, Sweden is famously secular and has been for quite some decades. In fact, it was ruled continuously by the Social Democratic Party from the 1930s up to the 1970s. So what was happening there? Well, they actually introduced eugenics and they introduced sterilization. So from the period the 1930s until the 1970s, 60,000 people, 90% of whom were women, were sterilized, often on the grounds that they were feeble-minded and sometimes they were unmarried mothers. So they were incarcerating, using eugenics, diagnosing as feeble-minded and sterilizing. This is in a secular, social democratic environment. Same in parts of Switzerland. Same, by the way, in Britain. They didn't get around to sterilization, but they did bring in this, I think it was Imbecility and Feeble-Mindedness Act in about 1908. And they began to just very widely misuse this diagnosis of feeble-minded. And there were quite a lot of people, including unmarried mothers, incarcerated in institutions on the grounds of feeble-mindedness. Same thing was happening in the United States. So if you remove religion from the picture, do you get a much improved picture? And the answer is no. And the report acknowledges this, and it mentions Netherlands, and it says basically from about the 1950s, the kind of religious view of this unmarried mothers and their babies began to disappear, and they said it was replaced by a psychiatric view, and the psychiatric view regarded them as mentally ill. That's in the report, and then that finally goes away in the 1960s and 70s. So the report is extremely interesting and honest from that point of view.
And Breda, you know,
an interesting comment.
You pointed out yourself as well. These are not specifically Irish or specifically Catholic, but yet people do expect a higher standard from the church in the treatment of people. And frankly, some of the treatment in the report was, I think, it can only be described as anti-Christian in terms of the attitudes and the behavior. What should have been the attitude? What should have been the Christian view?
You know, my big worry is, you know, would I have behaved any better? Because there were people who stood outside the consensus, but they were the minority. But obviously what one would hope is that you would cherish life, that you would cherish a child. It doesn't choose how he or she comes into the world, so they should be cherished regardless. And what you would have hoped is that, you know, rather than being seen as something that's stigmatized and so on, that people would have helped people to stay with, you know, mothers to stay with their children. And I think is important to look at as well is
the Frank Duff approach, Breda.
Oh yeah, the Frank Duff approach, exactly. But something I think is important as well is there is a kind of a shadowy thing in the background there. Now, the report does mention people who did behave honourably, but quite often the women were left. There's an account in one of the testimonies of someone who went to England with her boyfriend, and he ditched her there. So when she got to England, that he just abandoned her because it was easier for him to abandon her in England. And there was a whole traffic, in a sense, sending people back to Ireland. They had a whole, I can't remember, maybe David remembers the term. It was basically pregnant from Ireland. That was the term. So what we would hope is that, you know, that you would say, kind of you would have the attitudes that our Lord would have had to people, which was to cherish the person and to challenge the person, but not to make them feel like they were subhuman or that they had done something absolutely appalling. I remember, even though I still would have been very nervous about going home to my mother if I were pregnant, I remember my mother being very compassionate about it and saying, you know, it's the most public sin. And she said, men don't have an equivalent public sin, because you cannot conceal the fact that you're pregnant, which I thought was feminist in a good sense, you know, from a woman of a much older generation, that so she was very compassionate towards people in that circumstance. Funny enough, actually, she gave her wedding dress away to someone who had to get married. I remember seeing that it had been let out because someone had to get married, which of course was a thing that happened at the time as well. But you'd hope that there would be compassion and mercy, but you know, there's lots of situations in Ireland today where there isn't much compassion or mercy either, and we don't want to look at those.
But you see, I mean, like every society in history has had children that somebody didn't want, all right, and was inconvenient at this moment in time, and they wanted to put away, and they wanted the mother put away as well. But there's still the same phenomenon of children being conceived who somebody doesn't want, and it could be the mother, it could be the mother's boyfriend, it could be the mother's parents, and what happens? And we know what happens. The babies are terminated, the pregnancies are terminated. Now, this is something that's barely even whispered, but this is how we deal with this problem today. And I mean, I don't know, like how many, if a 20-year-old going to university becomes pregnant and goes home for the middle-class parents, what happens? You know, are they welcoming this child with great joy and anticipation? And I think often the answer is no.
So you think basically we're just dealing with unwanted pregnancies in a different way nowadays?
Yeah, and I mean, you have to kind of, you know, hesitate to point this out, because every society, of course, develops a certain moral consensus, and it's difficult to defy it, and it's difficult to point out certain things. And so people don't want to be told, well, hang on a minute, abortion is not exactly a fantastic solution to this either, is it? The mother and baby homes and the social stigma of the past, terrible, and to be acknowledged as terrible. And then you've got to look and say, well, okay, how would I have behaved in the middle of that consensus? And then we look at the people who stood out, like Frank Duff and the Legion of Mary. And by the way, even though he tried his best to keep these mothers and their babies together, he very often failed, because the mother would leave Regina Chaley. She didn't want to go home, or maybe she wasn't allowed to go home, or maybe she was in a slum and a tenement, literally no room for her, has to make a living for herself, had got pregnant in domestic service, comes back out of Regina Chaley with her child and says, I can't raise this child. I have to go back into domestic service. So actually quite a few of the children ended up in industrial schools, which Frank Duff also hated. But he was fighting against the economics and the social attitudes of the time, and he found it extremely hard work. But today's society has got to ask itself, how do we deal with the children that somebody today doesn't want? And for sure, the answer is often not one bit humane. So we have to be careful about judging our forebears. And we also have to wonder, if you dropped 10,000 people at random who are around today, and you dropped them into poor rural Ireland, west of Ireland, we say 1930, how would they behave? And would they behave very differently? And I'm not so sure.
And Breda, one of the things that strikes me, obviously we all agree that no baby should be adopted against the wishes of the mother. But it strikes me that in some of the narrative around the report, there seems to be almost an undercurrent that adoption itself is a bad thing.
Yes, and I think part of that stems from something good, and part of it stems from something not so good. And the good part of it is the recognition that where possible, it is better for a child to be reared by the people who brought him or her into the world. And I think one way we have improved is that there are more women keeping their babies, and there are more means of doing that. But yet, if you look at it, you'll also have to say that it's a quick route into poverty, even still, to be a lone parent, particularly a lone mother. But on the question of adoption, there is a strong thing among young girls. In one of my lives, I'm a teacher, and there's a very strong thing among young women that it is more ethical or more right to have an abortion than to adopt a child. And I have two sets of cousins who are adopted, so and obviously I also have students who are adopted, so this hits me in the gut every time I hear it. But it's a very prevalent a very prevalent opinion. And the tragedy is it has never been, in a sense, a better time to be adopted, because if you're adopted nowadays, it's very likely to be, you know, an open adoption. You're you're encouraged to have from the very beginning to inform the child and so on. People are aware that, you know, that it's not just a magic bullet and so on. So it's a terrible pity at a time when conditions around adoption, in a sense, have never been better. It is now seen as, you know, almost the worst of the options. And there are situations where people have been, and I know many of them, where people have been very successfully adopted and have, you know, have loved their adoptive family without ever forgetting, you know, where they came from and so on. And I think it's a terrible pity.
And we only have a few minutes left. So Breda, maybe I'll ask you before I go to David, are we getting the balance right in terms of where the blame lies between church, state, and, if you want to say, wider society or families?
Well, I suppose there is a truth in what's everybody's fault is nobody's fault. But if you looked at it from a slightly different way and said, you know, were there elements of church, state, society that were all at fault, I think you'd have to be a very kind of prejudiced person to say no to that. There definitely were flaws on all sides. And you mentioned earlier on that we expect more from the Catholic Church or from Christian churches, and that's true. We do, and we should hold ourselves to a higher standard. But at the same time, if we live in a society nowadays where we want the state to be more and more involved in our lives, we should also hold the state to higher standards. And we all come from some kind of a family, so we should hold families and society to higher standards as well.
And what would you say to that, David?
Well, I agree. And I mean, I think the report did get the balance right. And I think that's one of the reasons the report has been attacked so strongly by some people. But I think that report, I mean, what was it, 5 years in the making, 2,800 pages, extremely exhaustively researched. I think it will stand the test of time.
And finally, David, the religious orders who were involved in the running of the homes have been very forthright in their apologies and accepting responsibilities. What should they do now?
Well, I mean, I think the apologies were right and proper. And I think the Bon Secours sisters, I think, have indicated a willingness to pay into some kind of reparation fund. And I think that's right and proper as well. Because even though they were behaving according to the customs of their time, again, some of those customs and attitudes were formed by the church and should have been challenged. And I think I just repeat it again, the fact that Frank Duff found a different way shows that they also could have found a different way, and they weren't able to step aside their time, and they weren't able to offer a properly Christian perspective, and therefore it's fitting that they should make some kind of reparation for that.
And Breda, the $64,000 question, where does the church go from here?
It is the $64,000 question. I think the church has to acknowledge its part. Any wrongdoing, has to, you know, insofar as possible, make reparations for that. But also acknowledge the fact that one of the central things of our belief is that we're sinners. We do what is wrong. We constantly need forgiveness. And we cannot, in a sense, stop making a stand in the public square because of this. We actually have to continue to stand up for values that very few other people are going to do so, but in a humble way and in a way that acknowledges the grievous faults, not just of the past, but I'm sure of the present as well.